Okay, so now that we know that it's important to look at geomorphic conditions, two of the ways we might think about geomorphic conditions and network tools that we have that can help us get at that are riparian conditions and beaver. So let's talk about riparian conditions first. So here's here's a little riverscape, right? And we could ask a question, are the woody or vegetative resources present to support processes of wood accumulation? Wood accumulations are really important structural elements that structurally force more complex habitat and in general increase capacity for fish. As well as potentially increasing their survival. What happens when you structurally force hydraulics? You create a lot of energy refugia and predation refugia that might help increase survival in response to different sorts of disturbance conditions, as well as potential threats from predation. So this is something that's central in the sort of in the low-tech process-based restoration planning process, where we ask what are those current conditions from a riparian perspective. And so one model that can give us insight to this is a model that's called RCAT, or Riparian Condition Assessment Tool. And so this, one of the things that RCAT does is it tries to calculate riparian vegetation departure, which is basically just the percent of riparian vegetation that's been lost in the valley bottom. So I'm going to pause for a second. What do I need to be able to potentially address that? Well, one of the things that you're going to need is a map of the valley bottom. Well, we have that in VBET. Okay, what else am I going to need? Riparian vegetation. All right, so I'm going to need some layers that approximate where riparian vegetation is now. Oh, has been lost, right, and then historically. So let's take a look at this. Here we've zoomed in. It's not pretty. This is just a 10-meter digital elevation model in the background, and the black is our valley bottom delineated. And we've even broken up our valley bottom into some arbitrary, sort of a fixed segment length, right? So maybe this is 500 meters or 300 meters. And so in each of these cells, we can look at what are the pixels, and these pixels that are green, these are 30-meter resolution pixels, so these come from Landsat versus the 10-meter DEM. And which ones are riparian vegetation? And so those are the green cells. We can contrast that with a model that attempts to predict what the conditions were historically, okay? And this is the contrast between those two, all right? So if we were to take this and say, right, this entire area must have been riparian historically, that would maybe over-exaggerate the degree of loss, okay? This model, in some of these places, it pretty much is the whole valley bottom, but in other places, it's not quite. This model is biophysical settings, a state and transition model that Landfire developed. It attempts to model what the pre-European disturbance vegetation conditions were. So if that's the case, what do we have? We have something that's a little bit less than the whole there, and so that's what we use as our upper, as our expected of what could be. Okay, and so on a reach-by-reach basis, what we do is we lump it into some categories. We actually calculate a numeric value, a proportion, a percent departure. So in this reach, it might be, a large departure greater than 66%. In this reach, a significant 33 to 66. A minor departure, etc. And so this is another way of sort of illustrating that. This is out of a paper that Wally McFarland and others published. And then this is an example of that model being applied to the whole state of Utah. Okay. So this is a really sort of useful way of looking at riparian conditions and the thing that can grow vegetation. That's one of the lines of evidence that's used in RCAT. What else informs riparian condition? Well, one of the things is just if we take a closer look at those vegetation classes, I kind of glossed over this right here, but there's actually quite a bit of detail in terms of what communities, Gamble Oak Service Fairy, Wyoming Big Sage Wheatgrass, the Salt Bush Greasewood, etc. So there's quite a bit of detail on what those things were. And so we have this other map, which is what is riparian vegetation conversion type. And so if I was just to look at riparian conditions in this part of the basin, it looks like I've got a bunch of poor and then a bunch of good here in those upper headwaters. Well, the areas that are green are areas with negligible to minor vegetation conversion. All these other colors, what they represent is, well, what caused that? So was it conifer encroachment into those valley bottoms? Was it conversion to agriculture, which we're seeing in this part of the basin? Conversion to grass or shrubland. These purples are conversion to invasive species. There are areas that have just been devegetated, and then other areas that have been developed. Okay, and so those basically allow us to look at the cause. And understanding the cause might help you identify whether or not we're talking about fighting a pretty serious battle, like trying to get rid of tamarisk, whether or not we're fighting land use battles that you're probably not going to win, or maybe that you might be able to win, versus conifer encroachment, where you might be able to get in and do conifer removal in these valley bottoms and actually use that wood for structural forcing. So there's a whole bunch of information that this gives us, and this also helps hint directly at condition. So in RCAT, we produced this thing called the Riparian Condition Assessment Tool, and so in addition to that riparian vegetation departure, it uses a couple other lines of evidence. One is floodplain accessibility, and so that is if I have a valley bottom, but it's cut off by a levee or a road, those are scored lower. And then another one is land use intensity, right? And so a road might have a high land use intensity, or a house, right? Urban would be high. Agriculture would be scored something, in between, okay? Versus natural would be scoring quite high. And so here's an example. This is actually from the Weber, just to the south of us, where we've got disconnected areas that are inaccessible because, in this case, there are levees, there are interstates, and there are railroads that cut off in red portions of the valley bottom from being accessed by that system. This is a land use intensity map, and this really plays out quite interestingly across different parcels. And what we do is we take the land fire data, and it breaks it out and gives us developed areas, it gives us agricultural areas of different types, pastures, and what we would call, more natural riparian land covers. And so those are broken out here, with the greens being the more natural and then the reds being the more intense land uses. And so we can map that within the entire valley bottom and then sum up and get a score that maps back onto the network line. And if you combine those three lines of evidence, riparian vegetation departure, the land use intensity, and then the floodplain accessibility, we can come up with an overall sort of score of riparian condition. And so this is just an example of that. In the next video, what we'll do is we'll talk briefly about BRAT, and this is going to use similar evidence, but look at it very much from the perspective of the dam building activity of beaver.